Morning all. I thought we could have a look at the classic Fischer versus Spassky match, game 4, which we haven't covered before on this channel. So I'm putting together hopefully a complete playlist for the match. There are already, all the decisive games have now been video annotated, so check out the playlist for that. But let's have a look at the draws, because these draws were not dull affairs. They weren't like quick draws after 12 moves. They were fighting draws, full of interest really. So game 4, let's have a look. E4 from Fischer, so played on the 18th of July 1972. C5. After knight f3, Boris plays d6. So open Sicilian, d4, c takes, knight takes d4, knight f6, standard stuff, knight c3, and now knight c6. This is a classical approach, putting simple developing move of the knight, putting more pressure on d4. Now Fischer chooses bishop c4. This is classified by chessgames.com, I think most sources, as the Fischer's Fischer-Sozin attack, Leonhardt variation, B88. So bishop c4. It looks fairly logical to put the bishop here, eyeing sensitive squares. And if e6 later, you can imagine f4, f5 having an effect as a general plan. e6 is played, and the bishop just drops back. Bishop e7, and now we see bishop e3. So not immediately castling. Now both sides castle. a6. And now this plan emerges, f4, which basically seems to want to put more pressure on the diagonal, liberate this bishop on the diagonal, and it's dangerous for black. So how does Boris react to this plan? He takes on d4, bishop takes d4, and now plays b5. So black's counter plan is to put pressure on the centre like e4, and maybe put the rook on c8. This is a very natural deployment, bishop on that diagonal. And white doesn't really want to invite also b4 in many cases, undermining this protection of e4. So Fischer chooses to play a3, preventing b4. Bishop b7, and now queen d3 supporting e4. The queen here is quite interesting. It can switch maybe if needed on the third rank, and then again, you know, e5 and f5 can be effective at the right moment, potentially. We get now a very aggressive move from Boris Spassky in this position. Looks like a very good move, maybe exploiting a slight problem, technical problem, with this queen in this particular location, in this particular moment. I wonder if I give you 10 seconds, can you spot the move which Boris Spassky played, which I think is quite strong? So 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, Boris is exploiting the queen and bishop here, which, as we've seen just recently in a Carlsen victory against Anand, this is very important to make notes of things like this, which look completely coincidental. But here, a5, and the point is, well, if queen takes b5, there will be bishop a6, skewering line. So b5 is cleverly taking advantage of the queen and rook, like this. And if knight takes, of course the centre pawn is going to drop. So what does Fischer do here? Well, he goes in now for e5, which might not be that desirable here, to try and win a pawn like this, because he is opening up that bishop on the diagonal, which is dangerous for g2. So let's see what happened. D takes e, f takes e5, and after knight d7, Fischer wins that pawn with the knight, which you might think, well, pawn up, where is the actual compensation? Well, the problem is now black has a strong move knight c5. He can be a pawn down here and potentially, you know, collect a very dangerous bishop pair, which is what he's doing with knight c5. If the queen moved anywhere else, well, I think tactically white is liable to fall apart here, but we'll check that in the second pass of the game, what's available to black. Fischer decided though that it was needed to play bishop takes c5 to remove this knight. Bishop takes c5 check, king h1. So we have here a very interesting position where white's attack has really been neutralized. It seems actually white is now being forced to play against the kind of gambit that black has created out of the position. So for the gambit, black has two raking bishops on the diagonals, which are seemingly quite dangerous and emphasised now with the next move, queen g5. Immediately threatening mate. Fischer is forced on the defensive with the white pieces. And if we look at this position after queen e2, well, with this pawn here and this situation here, this is blunted by that pawn. The knight really hasn't got an easy time of it in this position. So, but it has got a potential hook on d6 with this pawn. So let's see what happened. Rook ad8, and Fischer contests that d file because otherwise rook d2 looks incredibly strong. So he contests the d file, an exchange of rooks. Now Boris plays another very aggressive, direct, attacking move. He plays h5. So if this pawn can come to h3, this would be very, very dangerous. In many Kasparov games, the Sicilian is often using the h-pawn with great effect, especially when there's a bishop on this diagonal. So this is a dangerous position for Fischer to have to defend. He plays knight d6, kicking that bishop to a8. And now, bishop c4. Okay, so the bishop's got more options now to come back into the game and maybe challenge this monster bishop on the diagonal. h4, immediately threatening h5, which would be quite painful on the diagonal. But one has to be wary here about playing a move like h3 because of the dark squares, but Fischer does play h3. And now the dark squares, if there's a battery on h2, that would be very, very dangerous, like this h2 battery to threaten mate. Spassky plays for that. He's able to play bishop e3 in this position, it seems, but we'll check in the second pass if there's any real technical hidden issues here. In this position, Fischer doesn't mind offering exchange of queens. He plays queen g4, and at the same time, if the queen isn't taken, if queen e5, well, that's the game continuation. But the h-pawn is also attacked, so that's another thing about this. So if Boris had taken the queens, you might think h3 is dangerous. Now perhaps, without going into here do too much detail, maybe the move here to try and defend is bishop f1. But let's check after the game. So in the game continuation, queen takes e5, getting a centre pawn for a flank pawn, but that pawn was marking out key dark squares. Now another really aggressive move from Boris here, a forcing move. He plays, perhaps you'd be surprised by this, g5. It's not the sort of move we would do that often, but g5 here seems quite logical and justified. Kicking the queen, it goes to g4, and now bishop c5, another forcing move. And if black gets time, he's going to use this h file to put more pressure to coordinate with the bishop. He's going to play king g7 and rook h8, And you might think this is really outrageous. Outrageous. How can g5 and king g7 be possible here? Well, black has good dark square control. He's quite strong on the dark squares, so he can afford this strategy. Very aggressive strategy indeed. So in this game, Fischer looks to be quite passive against Spassky, the world champion at the time. So Fischer, the challenger, he plays knight b5. Okay, knight b5, and now we see the very aggressive king g7. So it looks as though you might be surprised by this game. It looks like passive play from white for most of the game. This poor knight stumbling around, but it finds a nice square now on d4, which it can be supported with c3 soon, if needed perhaps. Rook h8. So what are the immediate threats? Well, rook h4 looks like a menace. If the queen is kicked from the protection of h3, then rook h3. I'm not sure even e2 is actually possible, but rook takes h3 would celebrate that pin on g2. So rook h4 is a major threat in this position. So white has to tread very carefully. He breaks the pin on g2 by playing knight f3. This knight is helping defend white. But what about this pawn, you might ask? Well, black is always tied down to g5 here. And actually this is a fork now, and it's reacted to bishop takes f3, queen takes f3. But what about bishop d6? Okay, that is played. But here, g5 did come at some cost to black's king safety. And white can use the option now to stop being mated by playing queen c3. With this pin, white is now threatening, of course, rook takes d6 as well, tactically. The queen's come off, doubling white's pawns, and it looks calmer now, the position after bishop e5. So, white is a pawn up, but doubled pawns. Black's dark square control seems strong. Rook h4 seems a very useful resource in this endgame to try and torture some of these pawns, at the moment anyway. But there's a rook on the 7th, aggressive now. So bishop e6, immediate threat, pinning that pawn. King f6, unpinning, protecting the pawn basically. On e6, king g1. Bishop takes c3, equal on pawns now. So opposite coloured bishops. You might think, are they going to agree a draw soon? A few more moves. Bishop h5, targeting f7. That's defended elegantly with rook c7. Now a pair of rooks come off, and it looks really drawn now. Surely opposite coloured bishops. White's got this pass pawn here, and black's got the 3-2 over here. But it neutralises in the game continuation pretty soon from this position. King e7. Black tries to make use of the pawn majority in theory anyway. Bishop e5, cutting the king away from some certain dark squares. After c4, king d6. Bishop f7, tying the black king down from being too adventurous. Bishop g3, and now a tactical move here from white. c5, check. And with this, both players agree to draw. Now this was not a boring draw game, and I hope, for the sake of YouTube content generally, that the exciting draws are looked at by video annotators, and we can recognise the inherent content of games even if the outcome is draw. But sometimes there are the dull draws, but I believe this was a very, very scary position for white throughout much of the game. Let's do a technical analysis now in this second pass through. So let's turn on the evil engines. In this final position, well, let's see, if king takes, white might even be, I dare say, anything actually. It's opposite coloured bishops, so there's going to be no force to sort of win material. And this pawn is safe on the light square with that light square bishop. It's equal. Let's go back. So and have a look. So Sicilian defence, Fischer-Sozin variation, bishop c4. So bishop b3, dropping the bishop back. So that equals so far. So you might ask, after a3, well, was that necessary? There was apparently e5 immediately. We can check out. Is it more aggressive than the game continuation at least? Knight can come to e4. It seems technically white has a small advantage here. And it looks quite dangerous with that knight driven back. In fact, queen h5, it looks like the engine is lapping up this position a little bit, thinking white's better somehow. So what is actually going on tactically? Knight f6. Are we going to end up mating black in this variation? This looks very aggressive, this immediate e5. I wonder if maybe it had a... I'm not sure offhand without checking other games if this had occurred, this immediate e5 before, but it seems on the surface of this very brief engine analysis that this continuation might be plausible for a small advantage for white. Okay, that's interesting, but let's not veer too much then from the game. So in the game we see, after bishop b7, queen d3. So is that a tiny inaccuracy? Queen d3. So a5 is actually not mentioned by the engine. It is going into a gambit, and perhaps not liked by engines, this a5 sort of gambit. So now we see e5 here. So let's just check out queen takes b5, bishop a6. In fact, even with this exchange sack, apparently it's not that bad. If the bishop can reroute to d3, this could be quite dangerous. And then e5 is threatened. But yeah, I think black might be okay. Okay, it's about equal. It's not that clear cut, believe it or not. Anyway, so e5 was played, and we saw knight takes b5 with technically white has the advantage, but it looks like a ferocious gambit. So what about queen e3? That looks logical, more logical than queen g3. Looks to be completely asking for it. We've got a loose bishop on d4, bishop a6 just to undermine d4. And black surely is getting the better of it. Let's take care. Win the exchange. It's not too hot for white there. So in the game, queen e3 though looks to me quite plausible intuitively. Knight takes, but maybe it's just passive. Bishop c6, and then d4's vulnerable again. This might be a playable continuation. But black has that bishop pair compensation. So let's go back. White took on c5, which, okay, it looks as though it's handing black technically a small advantage. Bishop takes c5. Queen e3 looks, or queen c3 looks technically from an engine point of view stronger. So here black does have compensation for the gambit, in inverted commas. Queen g5 looks like with black having equalised, maybe successfully, you could argue. Queen e2 looks okay, but queen g3 just offering exchange of queens as well. Looks horrendous for double pawns initially, but white is a pawn up. But black looks to have a brilliant game here with the bishop pair. I think black's better, yeah, practically. Maybe even technically. So queen e2, rook ad8. I think Fischer did have a difficult position in this position. So where maybe did black go wrong? Maybe it was g5, the lust for playing g5 later. Seemed a bit of it. A little bit over the top. But h5 seemed, yeah, fairly dangerous without too many downsides. h4, prompting white to weaken himself. With h3. Now technically knight e4 is mentioned here, offering e5 getting off the bishop here. And I think, well, that's about equal. Black's done very well to get this position. Nice position. So after h4, okay, we see h3, bishop e3, and black's doing very well. Queen g4 now, offering the double pawns here. Option about queen e5, queen h4. I think g5 is controversial. It's often controversial. It often looks good, and maybe a lot of very strong players, for example Kramnik recently against Nakamura, played g5, which actually really turned out badly. So g5, why does it always turn out badly? Well, it's you learn to break the rules, but even those breaking the rules, later it rebounds on them, just creating loads of weaknesses. They might think it's justified to break the rules, but there's weaknesses on this diagonal, which is later used with queen c3. It's not really liked by the engines. Queen takes b2 here, just winning this b2 pawn seems a bit computer-like to want to just win material over here, but why not? Let's go with queen takes b2. It keeps the king solid, or does it? Bishop d3 threatening mate. Bishop a6 defending. What's wrong with this for black? The bishops look great. The queen looks a nuisance. If a5 can come back to the centre, black looks fine. King looks much safer than the game continuation. Is there really winning prospects? Well, this bishop can at least be neutralised with bishop e4. Maybe it would be a draw likely, but it looks as though black's got half a pawn advantage actually. Half a pawn advantage here. So could Boris have just been greedy and took that pawn? He plays instead this g5 move. Why is it that strong players sometimes are very tempted? It is a forcing move. It limits white's options, clearly. It does prepare a very attractive idea of getting the rook to h8 to come in for this brutal attack. It's lucrative in many respects. Okay, so bishop c5. Knight b5. The knight stumbles around. It's coming to the rescue of the king here with knight d4 to f3 to neutralise this diagonal. So this attack, at the moment it's not clear how this diagonal is going to be saving white or helping white defend. But it becomes clear once the queen hits the third rank now after knight f3. Bishop takes f3. Now there's possibility all the time of queen c3. Okay, the move here, actually bishop d6 runs into queen c3. But what about this rook h4? Because then rook h4 does support bishop d4. So let's go with rook h4. Could this really have justified Boris Spassky's idea of g5 a lot more? Rook h4 here. So if we went with queen c3, there's bishop d4, isn't there? Oh no, the bishop's hanging. Just take. And then rook takes e4, bishop's hanging. Pardon me. Rook h4 just hitting the bishop. Wow. There isn't really a serious suggestion of g4 here as a move. Cannot be serious, Mr. Engine. g4. This looks a huge improvement over the game, for sure. Now queen c3 is not possible. Just take on h3. That'd be much better, surely. That's not possible. Now if g4 isn't played, let's go with bishop f1. Again, this b2 pawn is always on pre in a number of times in this game and in variations. So taking on b2 here, queen g3, coming back. It looks as though maybe Boris missed an opportunity in this game. Was it too casual to play bishop d6 when he did? It looks as though rook h4, clinically, monster engines like rook h4 here, depth 19, rook h4, it looks dangerous. I don't know what you guys think on YouTube, but even though it's opposite coloured bishops, when it's opposite coloured bishops with attacks going on, they often favour the opposite coloured bishops because it's difficult to defend on the colour complex. You got less defence, and the opponent's basically got an extra piece on that colour complex. Rook h4 looks pretty dangerous. Okay, so maybe an inaccuracy. Bishop d6. So that was the exchange of queens, and White's kind of able to hold the position now. Perhaps you could argue comfortably. Well, this was a very good move then. This bishop e2, targeting f7 again from this angle with the bishops. Got h5 access. So the rook comes to attack c2, but the counter attack on f7. And then we reach finally a peaceful draw after c5. So I hope you'll agree it was quite an aggressive game from Boris Spassky, to say the least, especially g5. But the follow-up might be more accurate to really justify g5 more and not show up that weakness of the diagonal later, which was used to get the queens off. Okay, I hope there was something in there to get something from. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.